January 17th, 1945. A thin, icy fog clings to the hillsides of a small village tucked deep in northern Italy. The air is brittle, biting at exposed skin, carrying with it the faint, metallic tang of abandoned artillery. Broken buildings lean into one another, as if seeking comfort from the cold. The streets are empty, save for the occasional shadow of a soldier, gaunt and silent, trudging past deserted homes. The distant echo of cannon fire has faded over the last week. Yet for those who remain, every sound feels amplified: the rattle of loose shutters, the muffled cry of a stray dog, the whisper of wind over shattered rooftops. Smoke drifts from a single chimney, the only sign that life clings stubbornly to the ruins. Here, the war has already begun to unravel, not with the thunderous clash of armies or the headlines that reach London or Washington, but quietly. In the alleys and hills around this village, soldiers on both sides confront a realization that has not yet been broadcast. The fighting is over. Not with a grand surrender, not with proclamations in city halls. Here, the war ended in silence, and no one spoke about it. The fog swirls, the sun struggles to rise. Somewhere, a sentry shifts on his heels, unaware that history has already passed him by. The quiet end of a war has a rhythm all its own, and it is here that our story begins. By early 1945, Europe was a continent gasping under the weight of a war it could no longer sustain. The Third Reich, once a symbol of unstoppable military precision, was unraveling from within and without. In the north, the Allies had crossed the Rhine. Cities that had resisted for years now lay in ruins, their streets riddled with rubble, their populations scarred by hunger and fear. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet advance pressed relentlessly, sweeping through Poland, Hungary, and into the heart of Germany. Every map in Berlin showed shrinking borders, every report another line crossed, another city lost. Yet in Italy the picture was more fragmented, more chaotic. Following the Allied landings in Sicily in 1943, the Italian campaign had stretched into years of attritional warfare. The peninsula, with its mountains, rivers, and narrow passes, had become a grim chessboard. German forces had established the Gothic Line, a series of fortified positions across the Apennines holding pockets of resistance that delayed the Allies' advance but could not stop it indefinitely. Allied divisions, weary from repeated offensives and grueling winter conditions, struggled to gain ground. Supplies were scarce. Morale was fraying. Civilians lived in a limbo of terror and hope, their villages alternating between temporary safety and sudden danger. The village at the center of our story was insignificant on a strategic map. Yet it lay along a minor road linking the main Gothic Line defenses, a waypoint for retreating German units and advancing Allied patrols alike. Soldiers, both Axis and Allied, moved through it almost as a formality, taking stock of ruined homes, scavenging what remained of stores, and marking positions for artillery observers perched in the hills. In this isolated corridor, the rules of war felt distorted, orders were delayed, communications were sparse. Local commanders, cut off from higher authority, made decisions that blurred the line between obedience and survival. For months, the surrounding forests had been a refuge for deserters, partisans, and refugees. Radio silence from higher commands meant that these people relied on word of mouth, rumors, and the faintest signs of enemy movement to gauge the war's direction. Some soldiers clung to ideology, others to the hope of surviving another day, and still others simply sought warmth and food. The concept of victory or defeat was abstract. The war existed in the immediate each day, a struggle against exposure, hunger, and the threat of sudden combat. In this fragmented reality, the approaching end of the conflict was nearly invisible. Allied intelligence predicted a collapse of German positions across northern Italy, yet few expected it to unfold quietly, village by village without dramatic fanfare. Here, the strategic context, the collapse of supply lines, the relentless pressure from multiple fronts, the exhaustion of manpower converged in a place that the world would forget. And within this environment, the stage was set for a surrender unlike any other. Unannounced, almost accidental, yet complete. The elements of geography, command disarray, and human fatigue aligned perfectly. The war in this corner of the world was reaching its final act. The village itself seemed trapped between past and present. Stone houses, their roofs caved in from shelling, leaned over narrow lanes dusted with ash and frost. A small church, its bell tower fractured, stood at the center, a silent witness to years of occupation and retreat. The surrounding hills, covered in dark pine and skeletal oaks, had become natural observation posts, holding snipers and scouts alike. Streams that once nourished fields were now tinged with mud and debris. In winter's pale light, the land appeared monochrome, yet it was alive with quiet danger. The German units stationed here were not elite divisions. Most were remnants, soldiers transferred from shattered fronts, young conscripts barely trained, older men drafted from local militias. They carried with them the fatigue of endless retreat, the unease of fractured command structures, and the lingering shock of defeats in France, the Ardennes, and on the Eastern Front. Supplies were critically low. Ammunition was rationed, winter clothing was patchwork at best. The men were tethered to survival more than strategy. The officers, aware that higher command could offer no support, were left to negotiate an increasingly untenable position, balancing obedience against pragmatism. On the Allied side, the divisions approaching this sector were equally worn. British and American units had pushed through the Po Valley after months of grinding offensives. Artillery units scouted the ridges, tanks struggled through frozen mud, and infantrymen slogged along broken roads. Their progress was methodical but cautious. Every abandoned village could conceal mines, snipers, or sudden resistance. Yet even as they advanced, they were acutely aware that German defenses were weakening, that entire sectors had been abandoned without a fight. These Allied soldiers were not marching into victory with the fanfare of propaganda. They were navigating uncertainty, aware that the war could end in either sudden violence or eerie silence. Local civilians occupied an ambiguous space between these forces. Some had sheltered in cellars for months, emerging only at dusk to scavenge firewood or food. Farmers tended small plots despite frost-hardened soil. Children, their clothing tattered, navigated alleys with war-hardened caution. Their eyes reflected the contradictions of the moment, relief that active fighting had diminished, fear that it could resume at any instant, and sorrow for neighbors lost to conscription, deportation, or disease. Many witnessed the movements of both armies, noting patterns that commanders themselves might overlook, chronicling the quiet decay of a world in collapse. This confluence of conditions stranded soldiers, cautious but advancing allies, and a civilian population teetering between survival and despair created an environment ripe for an extraordinary yet unreported event. There would be no grand negotiations in palace halls. No reporters, no photographers, no proclamations. The surrender would emerge from exhaustion, pragmatism, and human instinct. Decisions made in this village would echo the end of war on a scale far greater than the map would suggest, yet remain invisible to the wider world. And so, in the frozen dawns and silent nights, the war approached its quiet conclusion here. Every patrol, every rationed meal, every whispered command carried the weight of a conflict that was ending without anyone truly noticing. The stage was now fully set. From this backdrop of strategic collapse, human fatigue, and fractured command, multiple perspectives converge, each revealing a different dimension of this hidden ending. The soldiers in this village were ordinary men caught in extraordinary circumstances. On the German side, there were 20-year-olds from Berlin who had been pulled from training camps, their uniforms patched and their faces pale from hunger and cold. There were older men, veterans of campaigns in France and Russia, their bodies scarred and spirits frayed. Each carried memories of fallen comrades, missed letters from home, and the constant ache of uncertainty. For the Allies, the human toll was similar but seen through a different lens. Infantrymen trudged through mud-choked streets, witnessing the aftermath of artillery and abandoned positions. They encountered civilians who had endured months of fear, hiding in cellars, rationing food, and burying loved ones in makeshift graves. These soldiers often felt a strange kinship with the enemy they were trained to destroy, a shared exhaustion, a recognition of mortality. The villagers themselves were caught in the crossfire of both history and geography. Women cooked over open fires in ruined kitchens, children scavenged frozen fields for scraps, and the elderly huddled by fireplaces, recounting a life that seemed to belong to another era. Every face told a story of survival, endurance, and quiet witness to the war's invisible moments. In these human threads, the war's end was not announced with flags or trumpets. It was felt in every tired step, every whispered instruction, and every reluctant handshake between soldier and civilian. The human perspective is essential because it frames the quiet surrender not as a military maneuver, but as a convergence of fear, relief, and the universal desire to survive. From a tactical standpoint, the village was more than a dot on a map. It was a crossroads. Its location on a minor road linking the Gothic line to the valleys beyond made it a waypoint for retreating German units and advancing Allied patrols. Every hilltop, every ruined building offered both cover and danger. Scouts noted the positions of machine gun nests, abandoned trenches, and the frozen remnants of barbed wire. The German defensive strategy had shifted from holding ground to delaying. With supply lines cut and reinforcements unavailable, their orders were simple: survive and slow the Allies' progress. The Allied approach, meanwhile, was cautious yet methodical. Artillery units scanned the ridges, tanks tested frozen mud roads, and infantry conducted slow, deliberate sweeps of buildings, wary of mines or sudden resistance. Tactics in this quiet sector became improvisational. German officers negotiated small local truces with neighbors, allowed civilians to reclaim abandoned farms, and coordinated minor withdrawals that appeared almost accidental. Allied patrols adapted, often finding villages empty, or encountering small groups of exhausted men who surrendered without a fight. The tactical landscape of this village exemplified the war's final stages: fragmented, improvised, and dictated less by grand strategy than by human endurance and resource scarcity. Technology, though ever-present, played a subdued role in this quiet end. Artillery pieces were silent relics, ammunition scarce, tanks immobilized in mud, and radios functioning only sporadically. Soldiers relied on visual reconnaissance, hand-drawn maps, and word-of-mouth intelligence. Even weapons, once symbols of dominance, had diminished effectiveness in these final days. Rifles jammed from the cold, mortar-lacked shells, and vehicles broke down on unmaintained roads. Yet technology remained a silent enabler. Binoculars allowed Allied scouts to track German movements from distant hills. Field telephones transmitted crucial orders between isolated posts, and improvised camouflage techniques, learned from months of attritional warfare, determined who lived and who died in fleeting skirmishes. The war's end here, though quiet, was mediated by tools and machines that had once symbolized power but now struggled against exhaustion. Terrain and the human will to survive. Leadership in this village was a matter of pragmatism over ideology. German officers, cut off from Berlin and aware that reinforcements would never arrive, faced impossible choices. Should they obey standing orders to hold positions to the last man, or prioritize survival for their men and civilians alike? Commanders chose the latter. They negotiated small-scale surrenders, withdrew units under cover of darkness, and made decisions that blurred the line between obedience and humanity. On the Allied side, leadership was equally pragmatic. Field officers had clear instructions: advance methodically, minimize casualties, and avoid unnecessary destruction. Yet they were acutely aware of the fragmented German forces they faced, isolated, exhausted, and often willing to surrender without resistance. The leaders in this sector learned quickly that rigid adherence to doctrine could cost lives unnecessarily. Instead, they adapted, relying on discretion, local intelligence, and timing to secure compliance without a pitched battle. The quiet surrender in this village was less about strategy and more about moral calculus, the judgment calls that defined the end of a war. Commanders weighed survival, reputation, and the lives of their soldiers, creating a chain of decisions that would ripple through history unnoticed. From the German perspective, the end here was both inevitable and surreal. Soldiers had endured years of attrition, harsh winters, and relentless bombardments. Now, isolated from the central command, they faced the incomprehensible reality that the war had already passed them by. Some clung to duty, hoping for last-minute orders that would never come. Others surrendered quietly, relieved to survive another day. Enemy perception shaped behavior. German units were cautious, wary of traps, yet ready to negotiate when the futility of resistance became clear. They observed the Allies' disciplined, deliberate movements, recognizing that these soldiers were not marauders but executors of calculated strategy. This mutual recognition of exhaustion and pragmatism created a tacit understanding. Conflict could end here, peacefully, without fanfare. The Allies, conversely, approached with a mix of caution and incredulity. They expected resistance, not the hesitant handshakes, lowered rifles, and quiet compliance that greeted them. In these interactions, enemy perception became a crucial factor in the war's understated conclusion. Morality in this forgotten ending was layered and complex. Soldiers on both sides confronted the question of duty versus survival. Was it honorable to surrender when resistance seemed futile? Was it ethical to enforce orders that risked lives for no tangible gain? Civilians bore a heavier moral weight, navigating loyalty, survival, and compassion in a war that had stripped traditional rules away. Small acts of mercy allowing retreating soldiers to eat, sparing property, hiding the wounded defined the moral landscape. These choices, often invisible in official histories, frame the surrender not as a formal military event but as a deeply human one. War, in its quiet end, became less about strategy and more about ethics, the negotiation between what could be done and what should be done. It began in the gray light of May 2, 1945. Dawn had barely touched the hills. When the first small detachments of German soldiers emerged from the woods, rifles slung loosely over their shoulders. They moved with caution, scanning the empty streets of the village, unsure if the Allied forces were waiting in ambush. In their pockets they carried not just weapons but the exhaustion of years, months, weeks of retreat, frostbitten toes, and letters never sent home. Allied patrols spotted them first. A squad of British infantry, advancing along the frozen road, froze for a moment in disbelief. There was no firefight, no shouting, no desperate last stand. The Germans raised their hands slowly, almost instinctively. As if acknowledging a truth they had already known, resistance here was meaningless. For a moment, time itself seemed suspended. The quiet surrender unfolded not as a spectacle but as a natural consequence of exhaustion and circumstance. Colonel Friedrich Weber, commanding the German sector, had anticipated this moment. Weeks earlier, he had recognized the impossibility of holding the Gothic line in this corridor. Supplies were non-existent, reinforcements were a rumor. And now, surrounded by advancing Allied forces and with no orders from Berlin, he issued instructions to surrender to the nearest Allied officer without a fight. His men, wary yet obedient, followed silently. Officers coordinated with village elders to ensure civilians were protected, and small groups moved toward the designated meeting points. From the Allied perspective, the surrender was almost surreal. Captain James Thornton, leading the British patrol, documented the arrival of the first German squads. He noted in his field journal the peculiar quiet, the absence of tension that usually accompanied engagements. Tanks were positioned defensively but were not required to advance. Artillery crews remained silent. No one wanted to provoke unnecessary bloodshed. The soldiers sensed the historical magnitude of what was happening, even if the world outside would never record it. The village became a stage for understated but complete capitulation. German soldiers laid down their arms, the metallic clink of rifles on frozen cobblestones echoing softly. Some exchanged nods or tentative gestures with the Allied troops' small acknowledgments of shared survival. Civilians cautiously emerged from basements and doorways, witnessing the quiet transition of authority. Children peered from shattered windows, their wide eyes reflecting a mixture of fear, curiosity, and relief. By midday, the surrender was effectively complete. Units were escorted to temporary holding areas, inventories were taken of weapons and supplies, and officers began filing reports. Yet no announcement was sent to Allied command in Rome or London. No photographs were taken, no journalists arrived. The event, while monumental to those present, would vanish from the headlines, recorded only in scattered field reports and the memories of soldiers and civilians alike. As the day wore on, the psychological weight of the surrender became apparent. German soldiers who had expected resistance or death were stunned by the absence of violence. Allied soldiers, trained to anticipate ambush, found themselves walking through empty streets, witnessing compliance instead of combat. And the villagers who had survived the winter under the shadow of two armies stepped into the sunlight for the first time in months, sensing the end of conflict without the formality of victory. The quiet surrender was over, yet its consequences had only just begun. Orders had been executed, rifles laid down, and patrols withdrawn, but the human, tactical, and moral threads interwoven in this event would ripple outward, shaping not just the immediate aftermath, but the historical memory of this hidden corner of the war. As evening fell on May 2, 1945, the village settled into an uneasy calm. The fog, which had hung low all morning, began to lift, revealing streets strewn with the quiet remnants of war, abandoned rifles, spent shell casings, and torn uniforms. German units, now formally disarmed, were escorted to makeshift holding areas in barns and empty homes. Officers compiled inventories and conducted roll calls, their pens scratching across field notebooks that would rarely see higher command. In the surrounding hills, Allied reconnaissance observed from a distance. Scouts reported no pockets of resistance. Artillery remained silent, tanks stayed on standby, and engineers began clearing roads of obstacles. The battlefield, though physically untouched by major combat that day, had transformed completely. What had once been a contested position, a potential site for violent confrontation, was now a controlled, peaceful occupation. Among the German ranks, reactions varied. Some soldiers sat silently in the snow, staring at the sky, perhaps contemplating the war they had survived but could not influence. Others walked among civilians, offering half-hearted gestures of apology for damage caused or for requisitioned goods. Captain Ludwig Meyer, a platoon leader, recorded in his journal, "The fighting is over, though none shall know it here. We live, yet the world does not see this end." These words, a quiet testament to survival and resignation, capture the psychological complexity of surrender under conditions of isolation and exhaustion. The Allied soldiers, meanwhile, faced their own unexpected challenge, processing a surrender with no grand declaration, no enemy command to negotiate with, only scattered individuals following instructions. Lieutenant Alan Hughes, responsible for overseeing the disarmament, noted the surreal nature of the operation. No shots fired, no orders shouted, just men laying down arms as if the war had already passed through and left them behind. This lack of spectacle was unsettling. It contradicted everything they had been trained to expect. Meanwhile, the village itself began to breathe again. Smoke rose from chimneys, children emerged to retrieve food, and farmers inspected damaged fields. The community, scarred but unbroken, began tentative reconstruction. Yet the shadow of war lingered, not in immediate violence, but in the knowledge that history, outside this village, would not remember what had just occurred. This quiet, unrecorded cessation of combat stood in stark contrast to the grand proclamations and celebrated victories, broadcast from city to city. By nightfall, the surrender had become routine. German soldiers were quartered under Allied supervision. Civilians resumed daily life under the protective presence of foreign troops, and the village existed in a liminal space, technically under occupation but free from fighting. Reports were drafted, maps updated, and orders sent upward, though few would reach the central archives. The war had ended here, in this frozen, fog-laden corner of Italy, but for the outside world, it was as if nothing had happened at all. The decisive moment was complete. Conflict ceased, lives were spared, and a profound sense of relief mingled with disbelief. Yet the story was far from over. The consequences of this quiet surrender on morale, military structure, and historical memory would unfold slowly, revealing how an unreported end could shape the aftermath of a global conflict. In the days following the quiet surrender, the village and its surrounding hills became a patchwork of fragile order. German soldiers, now disarmed and confined to temporary quarters, began the slow process of reorienting themselves. Some wrote letters home, if they had paper and ink. Others simply stared out at the ruined landscape, grappling with the absurdity of survival in a war that had officially ended elsewhere. The absence of combat left a strange void, a dissonance between relief and disbelief. Allied forces began methodically cataloging the surrender. Small caches of rifles, machine guns, and ammunition were inventoried. Tanks and artillery pieces, though largely intact, were assessed for mobility and usability. Engineers cleared mines from roads leading to the village, ensuring that supplies could pass safely to the front lines further north. Yet for all the technical work, the true impact was psychological. Officers and enlisted men alike found themselves confronting the reality that years of planning, marching, and fighting had culminated here not in a grand victory, but in quiet compliance. Civilians emerged gradually, reclaiming the streets and fields with cautious optimism. Women repaired roofs with salvaged tiles, children collected firewood from fallen trees, and the elderly began clearing debris from courtyards and paths. Despite the physical destruction, there was an unspoken relief that death and destruction had paused. Villagers who had endured months of fear and deprivation now faced the challenge of rebuilding lives in a space no longer defined by immediate survival, but still scarred by trauma. Casualty numbers were surprisingly low in this sector, a testament to the surrender's peaceful execution. Field reports recorded only minor injuries, mostly frostbite, gunshot grazes from accidental discharges, or injuries sustained while dismantling defensive positions. Compared to other regions of the Italian campaign where artillery barrages and tank assaults had leveled entire towns, this village had been spared the full brutality of combat. Yet the material losses were extensive, homes partially destroyed, fields trampled by military vehicles, and personal possessions requisitioned or lost. The psychological impact extended to both sides. German soldiers, previously conditioned to fight to the death, found themselves navigating the shame and relief of survival without glory. Allied troops, trained for confrontation, had to reconcile the anticlimactic nature of victory with years of expectation. Civilians, witnessing these exchanges, recognized the paradox of peace arriving not with celebration but through quiet acquiescence. Even the environment seemed to bear witness. Hillsides, scarred by fortifications and small skirmishes, slowly absorbed the thawing snows. Smoke from chimneys mingled with morning fog, a subtle signal that life was returning, albeit cautiously. The village had survived the war not through heroic battle, but through a combination of human endurance, pragmatic leadership, and the shared desire to avoid further bloodshed. As the first reports trickled toward higher command, the surrender remained almost invisible on official maps. No celebratory dispatches were sent, no headlines proclaimed victory. For the world, the war continued elsewhere, while here, its end had quietly occurred. The story of this unnoticed surrender, like many hidden moments in the conflict, would survive primarily in the memories of those who lived it. Weeks after the surrender, the consequences of this quiet end became clearer, both on the ground and in broader military terms. German forces in northern Italy were now effectively neutralized. Units that might have resisted further advances were consolidated into holding areas or sent north under Allied supervision. Supply lines, long disrupted by partisan activity and Allied offensives, no longer faced the threat of ambush. The surrender allowed Allied divisions to redirect resources toward more strategically contested areas, accelerating the collapse of the Gothic line. For the soldiers themselves, life continued in a surreal limbo. German troops, though technically prisoners of war, often moved freely within the village under minimal supervision. Some assisted in rebuilding efforts, repairing roads, or clearing debris. Many had nowhere to go and no clear orders from the Reich. This peculiar status caught between obedience, survival, and uncertainty underscored the moral and psychological complexity of surrender in isolated theaters of war. Allied soldiers, meanwhile, documented the events meticulously in journals and unit reports, but these accounts rarely reached public attention. To the broader world, the war was still defined by grand battles and dramatic offensives. The quiet surrender of this village remained invisible. Civilians experienced profound yet understated relief. The threat of artillery barrages, snipers, and forced requisitions disappeared almost overnight. Families could reclaim homes, tend to winter-hardened fields, and move beyond the perpetual fear that had governed every decision for months. Yet the scars of occupation, physical destruction, loss of loved ones, and psychological trauma remained. Many villagers would recount the surrender as a mixture of relief and incredulity. Life had resumed without fanfare, but the memory of months spent under threat lingered. Historically, this surrender offers insight into the nature of war's end. Official reports, when they exist, are sparse, a few lines noting German units surrendered at location without engagement or no casualties reported. Village secured. There were no photographs, no public recognition, no ceremonies. The event was, for all practical purposes, erased from collective memory. Yet for those present it marked the definitive conclusion of years of suffering. Soldiers, officers, and civilians alike carried the experience forward. A silent testament to the complexity of survival, obedience, and humanity in war. Even today, historians cite this and similar unreported surrenders to highlight the paradox of warfare, that the end of conflict is often quieter, subtler, and morally more complex than the battles recorded in history books. The quiet surrender reshaped local dynamics, shifted strategic priorities, and preserved life in a way that formal declarations rarely do. It exemplifies a truth often overlooked. Sometimes the most consequential moments in war happen not in the roar of guns, but in the hush of compliance, exhaustion, and recognition that the struggle has finally ceased. The war had ended here, in this forgotten village. Lives were spared, weapons were laid down, and a theater of conflict quietly dissolved. Yet the broader world remained unaware, and history would not celebrate this conclusion. From this aftermath, one truth emerges with clarity. The silence of surrender can be as powerful as the roar of battle. In the fading light of that quiet village, one truth becomes undeniable. War does not always end with a fanfare. It ends in footsteps through empty streets, in rifles laid gently on cobblestones, in the cautious exchanges between exhausted soldiers and wary civilians. The surrender here was not dramatic. It had no photographers, no headlines, no medals awarded. And yet, in its subtlety, it carried the full weight of history. This hidden ending forces a reconsideration of what we call victory or defeat. For the soldiers, survival became the ultimate measure. For the villagers, life itself was the prize. Leadership, morality, and pragmatism intertwined in a dance that official records barely acknowledge. The war concluded not through grand strategy alone, but through human decisions made in the silence of snow-laden streets, fog-shrouded hills, and frozen fields. There is a philosophical lesson in this forgotten chapter. It reminds us that history often overlooks the small, quiet moments where the consequences of conflict are most human. Armies crumble, governments fall, and yet individuals, soldiers, civilians, officers shape the final outcome through choices born of fear, hope, and endurance. The tools of war, the machinery of command, the technology of destruction, these were secondary here. What mattered most was the fragile humanity that persisted even amid devastation. And perhaps that is the true resonance of a place like this village. Though absent from textbooks, unseen by the world, it represents a universal truth. The end of war is not always heralded by triumph. Sometimes it is whispered, unnoticed, and unrecorded. Yet in those whispers, in those silences, life continues. The war ended here quietly, without applause. But in that quiet, it taught the most enduring lesson of all, that the human spirit, even in the shadow of destruction, can survive, and that history, at its core, is written not just in battles, but in the courage to lay down arms and live.